My name's Liz Waite. I'm from California State University, Long Beach. I'm currently working on getting an organization together for homeless students on our campus, and this is probably the coolest thing I have done and will ever do, and it's to moderate this panel and be at this event. So yeah, let's get the ball rolling on the homelessness panel, and I'm going to introduce our speakers. So we have Rashida Crutchfield, Assistant Professor of Social Work, California State University. She's a 49er too. Rashida is an assistant professor at California State University, Long Beach, whose work focuses on research in youth homelessness and higher education. Rashida was the PI for Phase 1 and is a co-PI for Phases 2 and 3 of California State University's study on basic needs. So cool, thank you for being here. We have Dennis P. Culhane, Dana and Andrew Stone Chair in Social Policy, University of Pennsylvania. Dennis is the Dana and Andrew Stone Professor of Social Policy at the School of Social Policy and Practice at the University of Pennsylvania. A Senior Research Associate at the Center for Population Studies and the Director of Research for the National Center on Homelessness Among Veterans at the United States Department of Veteran Affairs. Dennis is a nationally recognized social science researcher with primary expertise in the field of homelessness. Dennis's recent research includes studies of the aging homeless population and vulnerable youth and young adults, including those transitioning from foster care, juvenile justice, and residential treatment services. We have Matthew Morton, Principal Investigator of Voices of Youth Count and Research Fellow, Chapin Hall. Matthew is a research fellow at Chapin Hall and an expert in runaway and homeless youth advocacy and program development. Matthew is the principal investigator leading the Voices of Youth Count research in partnership with others across the field to connect emerging evidence to action. And we have Russell Lowery-Hart, president of Amarillo College. Russell is the president for Amarillo College. His leadership focuses on improving student success through systemic and cultural change across campus silos, quote unquote. Students living in the war zone of poverty. Well said. Russell was selected into the inaugural class of Aspen Presidential Fellowship for Community College Excellence, a rigorous 10-month executive leadership program led by the Aspen Institute and the Stanford Educational Leadership Initiative. And going first is going to be the person who just spoke, Selma.
Excuse me.
Yes.
You forgot.
We
didn't
already
introduced me, did you?
She goes first.
Oh.
Okay. For
you
speaking.
can call me Justice too, but
for
y'all
Justice.
just introduce
Okay.
me.
So yeah,
be
we're
with
gonna
those.
start with Justice to are speaking on our panel. So yeah, this is really exciting.
Hello, everyone. I'm Justice. First of all, I appreciate being here. Before I go any further, I'm really honored to have a lot of support from our Houston Community College that are here today, and I would like to ask all of HTC to stand up, and also Daphne Hernandez from U of H who supported me. So everyone from Houston, please stand up, please. I need them to see all of us from Houston after Hurricane Harvey. This is how we adjust, and go Astros World Series, by the way. Well, I guess I can tell you a little bit about me, and what I want to say is I come from a working world. I've been working since age of 17. I was raised by my grandmother, who was the first African-American woman on the parole board in Texas before she passed. Okay, so I had a great life. After she passed, it bothered me a lot. I spent time in LA. When I was in LA, I was on radio. Okay, I worked on the set. I met people like George Clooney. I even met Tupac, really. So I had a great life. I came back to Houston, and one of my last jobs, I was employed at Verizon Wireless. The call center closed, and mishap after mishap, you have those, okay? And I want to discuss this because we have a lot of people that work, and you too can wind up like me. I never thought I would be that way, but basically I lost everything. Yeah, I had unemployment coming and all that, but after all the mishaps, I wound up sleeping in a truck for 30 days, a friend's truck after that in parks, in front of businesses. You know, I was at the lowest of my life. And I'm stressing this because I never thought I would be that way. Just like a lot of you who haven't experienced homelessness, you may not ever think when you lose your job, and let me tell you something about that, when you lose your job, we feel because we pay money, our taxes, well, if we're in that situation, they're gonna have something for us. Wrong. It's set up where homelessness helps the habitually homeless, if you're alcoholic, if you're a drug addict, if you have mental issues or disabilities. If you lose your job, sorry, it don't help you, so it don't help a student. So, you know, and out there holding the sign, I would have never once thought about going to school, but someone, you know, suggested that to me. So I wound up going to HCC, and in the beginning, it was hard because I was one of those individuals that spoke up. Before I said my name, I'm like, hi, I'm homeless, and my name is, but, you know, this is not a traditional thing for traditional colleges and universities for, you know, them to even know they have one homeless student versus a lot. So, you know, through 2 terms, it was hard for me. You know, I thought when I got my funds in spring, it would be the same in the summer. No, so I wound up the whole summer trying to figure out, okay, how am I gonna survive? So after class, I'm out holding a sign, you know, hoping I can have a roof over my head. But again, this is a struggle from a person that worked, okay? And I wanna stress this because, you know, there's a lot of people that live paycheck to paycheck, and you don't know it can be you too. Now, another thing I want to bring up, because I would have never thought about going to college, is for the school. When you're recruiting out there, you recruit. So when you see homeless people, talk to them too. You know, recruit them too, because they're just like me. If my friend hadn't came up to me, I never ever would have been at HCC, even though I went to college before. I never would have thought, because you're in that situation, all you're thinking about is food and a place to stay, because, you know, excuse my French, it's hell out there. It's really hell out there. So that's how I want to end it. I mean, right now I'm on the dean's list, I'm happy to say, with a 3.3 average. I want to thank Dean Adams, who wasn't able to be here. For that, HCC has really opened me to a lot of things, guys. I'm like a big kid the second time around, where I didn't think education was so important. It's like now, I mean, I get up like at 4 in the morning just to go to school. You know, I'm just like, you know, like I'm going to a circus or something. I'm going to school. You know, it's like I got different kind of backpacks, y'all, all that. Thank you, HCC, for the backpacks. But I ride my bicycle. I am happy that I was finally able to get a part-time job just recently. So I'm working, this is my 2nd week. I had to get a car, so I bought that from my school funds, but that car is only for work, because I'm not gonna live beyond my needs. I'm still struggling, y'all. You know, I was homeless for 1.5 years, and this past September was when I found a roof over my head, and a lot of things changed. But to the students out there, you know, continue to be vocal. I mean, it's gonna go in one person's ear and out the other, but there's people that are listening, and sooner or later, somebody's gonna step up. Somebody stepped up to me and said, hey, speak at the town hall meeting for the students. I went in there. Next thing, Dr. Sneed is like, oh, we must tell the world about this. Next thing I know, Jamaica Mills, the editor-in-chief of the ACC Egalitarian, is writing about me. Next thing I know, Sarah Goldrick-Rab, she's following me on Twitter and Instagram. Next thing I'm getting a call, Sarah's like, hey, you know, and I'm like, huh? Jamaica told me about you, blah, blah, blah. Next thing I'm getting people to write articles about me, but you know, it's not about me. I'm just a voice. I am a voice, you know, so I'm gonna be vocal about it, but I need other students to be vocal, and I need faculty and staff to understand it's not just one person at your school. There's a lot of homeless situations at universities and colleges throughout the nation, and they don't speak about it, but it's a lot. A lot of homeless students are in shelters that attend colleges, and you're wondering why you know, you get these dropouts. It's because they can't survive. They come there, but there's nobody to help them. So when you see a lot of students not returning, a lot of those are homeless students. So, you know, you may need to get that person in the college or university to be the liaison also for that homeless student, or even that person coming out of prison. But you need that person that they feel they can go to, you know? So that's all I gotta say. We got other people up here, I'm sorry. Any questions? Any questions? Oh, we're gonna circle and then we'll ask a question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Justin.
Anytime.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Rashida Crutchfield, and I have to say first, Liz, this is not the most exciting thing you will be doing. You're going to go on and do great things. And I'm here from the CSU, specifically Long Beach, but representing our CSU system, amongst others who are here as well. I like to say that higher education discovered collegiate homelessness like Columbus discovered America. In that people have been in it and dealing with it and living it for a long time before the rest of us decided to say hello and colonize. Fortunately for us in the CSU system, our studies have been led by Chancellor Timothy Waite, who really decided that this was going to be a commitment for the CSU system. So 23 campuses, 478 plus thousand students in the state of California looking at homelessness and hunger in our system. We talked earlier about we can't have a top-down approach, and yet I'm going to tell you that having done phase 1 of this study and talking to staff, faculty, and administrators, many of our folks were doing the work, but were doing the work quietly and diligently in their offices, in their classrooms, in their programs and services. But having Chancellor Waite sing Matt Morris's song meant that people who were previously saying, my institution is not a social service agency, started at least humming the song. And I'm not going to do that right now, but I wish I could, but I won't. But now we have definitely a full chorus of people moving forward. Dr. Jen McGuire and I are producing our phase 2 of this study, which is providing really a good focus on what students are experiencing. And a lot of what people ask us are, how many? How many? I need to know right now. And we're like, it's coming, it's coming. But they want to know right now, how many? How many? And we're going to tell you in January. We are. But we have been very committed to telling you those numbers with the students' stories. And those things have to be embedded and linked in this narrative, because we are fortunate and blessed to have students in this room who will share their stories with us. That is a blessing and is sometimes rare. Thanks, Sarah. So it is, and we have to make spaces for students to be a part of the leadership so that they can use their voice, but we have to make sure those opportunities are not tokenizing and are actual part of the decision-making of our process. And when students cannot be in those spaces, that we amplify their stories. So that's what I do every time I talk, is amplify the stories and narratives of students. I co-authored a monograph that will be available to you in the coming months with Dr. Ronald Hallett. Where's Ron? Where are you? He's in here somewhere, behind the pole, over there. And the monograph really speaks to a number of things, but it includes a housing insecurity continuum, which allows people to get an understanding of how we define homelessness. Because we know that HUD gives us a very restrictive definition of homelessness, and in higher education, as Mary talked about, it's bigger than just street living. Now, many of our students are street living. So in the last 6 months, I've talked to over 250 students who are experiencing these issues. And one of the stories that I heard from the end of the spectrum is Erica, who had the money she needed going into college. So she had housing, she had an apartment, but then, as in many places in California, her area is getting gentrified, right? So the owner of her apartment building decided to sell his apartment building. There were no rent protections for her. And so she had the money for where she was, but she didn't have a money for another move, for a deposit, and she ended up living in her car. At a completely different school was Tiffany, she said, I'm in a struggle circle, right? Because my mom is living with my sister. My sister has public housing. If public housing finds out my mom is in her apartment, then they're both gonna get kicked out. And sometimes I go there because I don't have any place else. But if they find me there, I'm gonna get my mother and my sister all homeless. And then sometimes I live in my friends' dorms, but if they find out I'm there, then they're gonna get kicked out. And sometimes I live on my friend's couch, but as she's moving through, she's concerned and constantly worried that she's breaking the relationships that she has with these bonds, with the support systems that she has. Next on the continue is unstably housed, meaning I might, again, have the money right now, but if something happens, if I'm behind in rent because I'm choosing between class and going to work, and if I don't work, I don't get my SNAP, but if I work too hard, then I'm gonna fail my classes, and then I end up homeless. And then one of the things that Ron really emphasizes in this monograph is the idea of trauma-informed practice, right? Because, towards the other end of the spectrum is someone who is completely housed, but has experienced homelessness. And I've been talking to some staff and administrators about the fact that if I have been homeless before, it's hard for me to trust that that's always gonna be there for me. So if I have a student, and I'm a professor, and when I tell my students, at the beginning of class, when I talk to them about holidays, exams, and disabled student services, and all of the opportunities on campus, I also, following the lead of Sarah, saying, and if you're having barriers to meeting your basic needs, let me know. And I think just because I say that, I get students in waves coming to my office. And I tell folks, I might say, I have these services for you, and a student might tell me no. No, I can't go into the dorms because someone might steal my stuff. Or no, I can't go to this service because someone has already told me no. Or put stipulations on getting that help, and now I don't trust you anymore. And understanding that history of trauma has to influence how I respond to students. Because I still have to be there, even if they say no to me. I got 1 minute. So one of the last things I want to say is also, I look at this whole experience and want to re-emphasize that we have to look at the collaboration across issues. Because in Long Beach, which is in Southern California, and it is on a beach, although it's not the best beach in California. Perhaps you might have heard housing is expensive in Southern California. And it's getting worse in Long Beach as Long Beach is getting gentrified. When we talk about these issues in Long Beach, we often talk about a tale of two cities, because we have within the city of Long Beach, in one zip code, the life expectancy is 7 years higher than another zip code within the city, right? And so often right now, as developers are coming in and changing the city, it's definitely become a conversation of us and them, and this conversation of affordable housing is being intertwined with the developers' voices, student housing voices, and the voices of the overall community around homelessness. And what is happening, from what I see, is this hierarchy of needs and hierarchy of worthiness. So when people talk about students who are homeless, sometimes they start latching on to one narrative and thinking, well, if she can do it, everybody can do it, and the students deserve our help, and this veteran or this other person does not, and we can't fall into that we are family in terms of our issues, and thinking about how we see homelessness has to be united in that effort. That's all I got. Yeah. Thank you.
Good afternoon. And I want to thank the organizers for the conference today for making a real contribution to our field in putting the issue of housing instability and food insecurity among college students on the national agenda. It's long overdue. We've seen hints and signs that there are problems. People have known from their own experiences as faculty working with students. But we really haven't had the kind of research that the HOPE lab has developed, that Sarah Goldrick-Rabb and her team have put together, and I think it's important. It's a guiding star for our field right now, and it's going to be really important in the next couple years, and certainly in the next year or two as people begin to think and frame solutions about exactly where the field goes. I'm just going to offer a couple reflections from the perspective of someone who's worked for almost 30 years in the adult homelessness area. I got involved in doing this work when I was 20 and I was an undergraduate, and I volunteered and lived in a soup kitchen and shelter here in Philadelphia for a couple of years, and have had many different jobs and roles over the years, working in shelters, working as an organizer among young homeless people struggling for their rights, and now as a researcher. My first caution would be around language. I think that we gravitate, and professionals especially, and advocates gravitate to the term homeless because it is evocative. It conveys an absence of something that all of us hold dear, which is the private space of our own lives, having a home, and to be denied that is, and to think other people are being denied that is very disturbing. But my caution about that would be twofold. One is that it can convey an overly static and stable and concrete status. In fact, it's sometimes used to talk about the homeless as though it's a trait in people, in a way that's not helpful, and can really be distorting of what the real experiences of folks who are going through this is like. In that same way, it can be stigmatizing, so that the people who were intending to help and serve actually don't want to be labeled with that term. They don't identify with it. And most people who we might, as academics, identify or as advocates identify as homeless don't actually see themselves in that way at all. A recent study came out that showed that more than half of the people who are staying in adult shelters, which we can all probably agree, if you're in an adult shelter for the homeless, you're experiencing homelessness, more than half of them would not use the word homeless to describe themselves, okay? And so I think that any effort to sort of create homeless services at colleges and universities is probably going to fail, because it's going to attract only a few people who might be willing to make that concession and go to a service that's labeled as such, but really people are instead looking for something that reflects their experience more broadly. In fact, there's been a whole area of participatory action research where researchers have stood aside people who are going through these experiences and come to an understanding and a richer understanding of what's happening. And I think that this is the place where we should be going immediately to start to frame how we want to respond. Because we don't want to respond by building programs and institutions that the people intended to serve don't want to go to. Okay, the most typical, of course, is the lurching into building more shelters that happened in the adult homeless world in the late 80s and early 90s, and then lo and behold, we talk to people who are living there, and the common enemy of the people who live there is the shelters. Okay, even though the well-intentioned people who built them think they're there to help and save and protect them, in fact, these become places that are inherently places of abuse and repression. Predatory individuals sometimes gravitate to being in staff positions in these places. So like all of these concrete institutions for poverty over the last 200 years, they end up being abusive. And so I think we got to be very careful about building institutions that not only are stigmatizing, but also make people who are vulnerable even more vulnerable to people who have power over them. I think a really interesting and important framework that's recently come out in this space about 2 weeks ago, the Homeless Hub, which is a Canadian homelessness research and advocacy website, came out with a new framework called Housing First for Youth. and I would strongly encourage you to look at it. It basically takes a lot of the lessons that were learned in the adult world and the family homelessness world over the last 20 years, and it took us a long time to learn lessons we should have been hearing before, but thinks about them in the context of the youth space. And it basically talks about, you know, treating people as deserving of housing because they have a right as a human being to housing, respecting choice, making sure that that choice includes an array of options that give people the ability to be self-determining, and having respect and command over their own private space. That is client-driven and individualized in the service approach, that does not have services attached to the housing, but rather people have their housings and they can accept and go along with services as they need them. Those are important principles that I think that you could benefit from. And lastly, I'll just mention a few other things that I think we've learned over the field in the adult and family world, is that we have to always be thinking about normalizing services and programs, things that do not treat folks who are experiencing housing instability or homelessness as a group apart, but as people who are actually just like everyone else, going through a tough patch in their lives. Even to the extent they may have some unique needs, they should be provided with the help and experience of the field that serves folks with those things, not creating some boutique programs that oftentimes end up being less than effective. And key to that is actually making sure that the mainstream systems work. And I know this is a theme I've heard repeatedly this morning, including the keynote, where really thinking about how the Pell program, how the SNAP program, all these things can really be expanded, because those are the building bases that can reach the most people and be the most effective, including the people who might be experiencing these problems but would never gravitate to a homeless program or a homeless service. So I think there's a lot of opportunities in the near future, and I think that as attention is being galvanized around this, it will be important to step back. A lot of enthusiasm among the folks here in the room. It's really great, and this is perhaps the time to be stepping back and thinking about what would the next couple years bring, and how will we begin to frame this in a way that is responsive to where the folks who are experiencing these things are coming from, and not from the institutional prerogatives that we so often come from ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me all right? Great. First of all, I just want to express my appreciation for the opportunity to be here. This is an amazing event. Sarah, thank you for inviting me. And I've got a terrific panel that I'm joined by today. I also want to just really authentically just thank you for your passion and your concern for this issue. As you'll learn in a minute, I'm a big geek. I currently lead the largest research initiative to date on youth homelessness in the United States. It's called Voices of Youth Count, and we're capturing a lot of very important data, and I'll talk to you a little bit in a minute about that. But I started this less as a geek and more as first a person with lived experience, and secondly as a young person who was incredibly empowered by what happens when the right things come to fruition in your life. And I had lost my mother as a child, my father when I was in my 20s. I grew up in a home with a lot of adversity, substance abuse, mental health, criminal justice, you name it. But I was the lucky one, despite those things, because I also had a teacher in my school who noticed something in me when others didn't. I had a coach who also spotted potential in me, and they, when I was 15 years old, helped me to get involved in the state of Florida's first fully youth-driven teen center. We did everything from painting the walls to interviewing, hiring, and firing adult staff. You want to see a nervous adult? Put them in front of a bunch of 15-year-olds who signed their paychecks. And it was quite a role reversal, but a really amazing experience. And we ended up succeeding to a large extent in developing this model teen center, and we were awarded as a group of 15, 16-year-olds $1 million to build several others. And that's when the White House invited me to be the first youth keynote for their first National Youth Summit. I went on and the rest was kind of history in a sense, in that I became a national advocate as a young person on these issues and cared a lot about them. But the more I looked around myself, the more I realized that there were a lot of young people who were the unlucky ones. In fact, most of them were the unlucky ones. My little sister was one of the unlucky ones. She has, and to this day, struggled with homelessness as a young person and all of the trappings around homelessness. And you all, I have seen countless young people in these experiences, and I continue to. And I had realized then at one of my mentors, I wanted to figure out how we go beyond a good story, how we go beyond something that's cute that a few young people did in Florida to something that could be a system response to vulnerable young people. And the president of the foundation that awarded the funds helped me really think about this. And he said, Matt, in God we trust, everyone else bring data. And I hated that he said that. And he kept saying it, and I hated it more every time he said it. But then I realized he wasn't the only one who thought that way. And I became a geek because I feel like it is my best tool, personally, to contribute to the movement to end youth homelessness nationally. I really believe that what doesn't get measured doesn't count for many of our audiences. And I also believe that many people think of the world around them when they try to understand reality. So when I talk to a number of policymakers or I go on the Hill and speak with congressional staff, they think, well, the college students around me didn't experience homelessness, or my friends didn't experience homelessness, or I didn't, so that can't be a significant issue. But on our initiative, we find that 1 out of 4 young people between the ages of 18 to 25 who experienced homelessness over a 12-month period were enrolled in college at the time of experiencing homelessness. This is a significant challenge and far more than most people realize, but the data helps us cut through ideology and bias in a way that can be incredibly powerful if we use it properly. So I just want to thank you for your commitment and your passion for this, but also your commitment to helping us get better evidence and data so that we can advance this issue. Now, because I work in youth homelessness, I was invited to share a few thoughts on lessons or things that are emerging from the youth homelessness space that might be relevant. So for one thing, and I know this sounds a bit gratuitous as a researcher, but I really want to make a pitch for more and stronger evidence, and especially related to interventions. This relates to what Sarah had brought up earlier. We are doing, finalizing now the most comprehensive systematic evidence review of interventions for youth experiencing homelessness that's ever been done to our knowledge. And the vast majority of evaluations of interventions for youth do not measure homelessness as an outcome. They don't measure housing instability as an outcome. They're measuring informational interventions, awareness interventions, mental health, you name it. All of these are important indicators, but we really need to test our operational assumptions. Are the things that we're doing getting us closer to the cause of ending youth homelessness? And if they're not, we need to adjust them. So I'd say first and foremost, that's for my research colleagues and those who fund them. We really need more, better, and stronger impact evaluation evidence around the interventions for youth or those experiencing homelessness. Second, I want to kind of pick up on what Dennis had mentioned. So housing first is a principle that is really gaining traction after a lot of time in youth homelessness. On the whole, I think this is an exceptionally positive thing. When I think of my sister, who's now 24 and experiencing homelessness, my sister has a lot of needs with the adversity that she has experienced throughout her life, the trauma that she has experienced without her life. She needs services and interventions and supports, and she knows that. None of those will make a difference for her until she has stable housing. If she can't be in a reliable place over a period of time, then it doesn't matter how good your workforce program is. It doesn't matter how good your mental health counseling is. She won't be able to show up and consistently. So housing first is a really tried and true principle. At the same time, I think too often the conversation gets narrowed to the extent that it's almost like housing only. And we don't continue the conversation into what young people really need to be able to sustainably exit homelessness. Not to just exit once, but to stay out of homelessness. And a housing subsidy for a lot of young people isn't enough. And we say yes, and support services too, but I don't think, especially in the youth space, we're paying enough attention to what works to address young people's needs to sustainably exit homelessness. Thirdly, authentic youth collaboration is something that is fortunately really gaining traction. You know my bias on this. I started with youth empowerment in my career as a teenager myself. But I'd say in the field of youth homelessness, it's becoming far more normalized. We have national advocacy groups. We have HUD is funding community collaborations and coordination around youth homelessness, and it necessitates youth engagement and action committees locally. This is a great sign, and I'm really excited to hear Sarah talking about this and others talking about this in the community or in the college setting as well. I think a couple of areas where we need to grow as a field. We've gotten better at making sure we're looking at youth with lived experience, but I think where we're not as strong is making sure we have what I call critical diversity. When you think of the young people that make it into committees or groups that have voice, they're young people that were nominated by a program that usually succeeded for them. A vast majority of young people that are experiencing homelessness are in situations in which systems and services have failed them. I don't think we're getting enough of that critical perspective and meaningful collaboration and voice. And so I think that's an area for us to go. And then the last two I'd mention, one is on upstream prevention. What our estimates next month on November 15th, we're going to share the first national prevalence estimates of youth homelessness for the age range of 13 to 25. Can't tell you the numbers right now, but stay tuned. But they're going to be bigger than what we're used to seeing from a lot of systems and snapshot data. And they will also show that the incidence rate of youth homelessness, in other words, the number of new cases, youth experiencing homelessness for the first time, is about half as high as the overall prevalence rate of youth homelessness. In other words, I could take all the young people off the streets or off couches tomorrow, and about half the number would be back experiencing homelessness again next year. That is incredibly important for policy because it means we have to have an upstream response. In the youth homelessness space, there are interventions. Like in Australia, there's a really interesting project called the Geelong Project. The Geelong Project screens and identifies every single young person, surveys them, every student in a school based on their basic needs. And then they triage them according to detected needs to either just watch and monitor towards case management or intensive wraparound support services. Because we know youth homelessness is so hidden, because we know it's fluid, we need a stronger upstream approach to identifying every young person who's experiencing homelessness or at risk of it, and to be able to quickly refer them to the services they need. Because the longer a young person spends homeless, the harder it is for them to escape homelessness. And then the last thing I'd say is that it's helpful for us to have a reframe. We're working with the Frameworks Institute. We're about to put out a bunch of data and findings on youth homelessness that we haven't had before at the national level. The danger is the messages could do more harm than good around those findings. And so I think we need to appreciate that messaging. And one of the takeaways I've had recently is that this needs to be less a problem of individuals and more a problem for our society. It's not good enough, and it's not necessarily helpful to say it's young people are experiencing homelessness and that's awful, or they have a right to be housed, or even that this will benefit them in specific ways. This is for all of us. We know from previous education data that young people experiencing homelessness don't actually perform much worse or much differently from young people not. The difference is they're more likely to leave school early. So take those two facts together. If you're likely to succeed, but you're likely to leave because of homelessness, that means all of us are losing our assets, our human capital for societal advantage and advancement and for economic competitiveness. And that's the message, that shared loss, if we don't address these issues, that we need to advance with policymakers. Thank you very much.
Several years ago, I was at an Achieving the Dream conference, and the speaker said, every policy, every process, every person, every college is perfectly designed to produce the results it's currently getting. were perfectly designed to produce the results we're currently getting. So for me at Amarillo College, that meant to really understand more fully why we were getting those results. And one of the reasons I felt like we were, at that point, we had a 19% completion rate, which in the state of Texas was above the average for community colleges. And we had undergone a storm of activity where we were creating new interventions and new programs and new approaches to everything we were doing. But we missed Justice's voice in that redesign. Love, kindness, service are not programs. They are the way we approach our service to our students. Programs absent of those systemic approaches to love and kindness will not change lives. You change lives, not a program, not an intervention. They may be tools to helping you get there. So often when I travel and talk about the war zone of poverty, I'm in a room of 400 people and I have to convince them that poverty is an issue. I don't have to convince you, so this is such a relief. We're in this room because we have a shared heart, because we have a shared understanding that something has to change. But too often we focus that something out there and rather than focusing it right here. So for me, I had a heart for our students, but I don't think I truly understood them. And for us to move from where we were to where we are, we had to place the student experience and the student voice front and center. And it wasn't just structural things like putting a student on the Board of Regents, even though that has some important value, but it is truly understanding who our students are and what they need from us rather than what we wish for them. So at Amarillo College, we've embraced what my colleagues roll their eyes, because I say this so much, so I'm giving you permission to roll your eyes as well, that we will love the student we have, not the student we thought we had or wished we had. So for me, there are some specific things that I would challenge you to think through. I can talk about the policy and the programmatic work that we're doing at Amarillo College with social workers and case managers and food pantries and every kind of intervention that you could want, and have it integrated into a system, into a culture. Not something that's inflicted on the student experience, but something that is foundational in supporting and understanding the student experience. We can have that conversation. I would love to have that conversation at another time. What I want us to talk about right now is how we can further understand and illuminate and lift up Justice's voice. So for me at Amarillo College, there are a couple of things that we've done that have really changed the way that I think about my work and my advocacy and what I do on a daily basis. I used to introduce myself as saying I was a recovering faculty member. I taught gender communication. And we often lead with our content expertise or our foundational training. What I had to understand is that I teach students communication. I teach and work with faculty to advocate for students. If students are front and center of how you describe your work, they might actually be front and center of how you do your work. So for us, I hired a bunch of secret shoppers some of which were homeless or struggling in the war zone of poverty, to go through our systems and tell me what did and didn't make sense to them, what did and didn't work. It was heartbreaking because we weren't trying to hurt students. We had put systems and policies and new offices and renovated spaces and one-stop shopped from the right heart with the right intent. We just forgot to allow students to tell us what they actually needed rather than build things based on what we thought they needed. So we have secret shoppers. They get scholarships. Currently, I'm the only person on campus that knows who they are, and they talk just to me. But it permeates our conversations as a college. What I think we have to do is to be hungry to understand that experience and to advocate for it and to build around it, and to have justice be the lead for any conversation you're having with your faculty and staff. Empower and trust your students to tell their experience. You don't have to tell it for them. Then build your interventions and your programs around a cadre of people who will love your students rather than doubt them, who will advocate for them rather than question them. I'm uncomfortable talking about the second element that we've used to really understand our students that are living in the war zone of poverty and battling housing insecurity. But I went through with a team of Amarillo College people through a homeless simulation. I don't like to talk about it out there, but I feel safe that I can talk about it with you because you'll understand when I say I could have tapped out at any time in the 72 hours, so it wasn't real. And the whole time I'm telling myself this isn't real, I could walk away any time. But I do think that the experience allowed me to understand some of the things that Justice talked about to lead off this panel in a different and a more profound way. I'd spent several years advocating for students living in the war zone of poverty, listening to them as secret shoppers. But until I went through the experience of what it means over a 72-hour period, I don't think I truly felt it. And the first day that I was homeless, I can't explain the shame that I felt. I didn't want to look people in the eye. I didn't want people to see me. I would literally duck in doorways when we were out in public when there was a family coming with strollers because I thought, oh my God. And this was not in my community. It was in Waco with Mission Waco. I'm literally at the fence where the silos are for the Gaineses if you watch Fixer Upper on HGTV. And it's free to go in. And one of the people that we met who was living homeless told us to go there because they have food trucks and people will drop change and you can find change there. But I was too ashamed to walk in the gate. We inflict shame on people without even knowing it. And shame for me came from applying for food stamps, applying for the housing voucher that we were challenged to do. But no one treated me like a person. They always treated me like a problem. You have that experience, Justice?
I still do sometimes. Definitely.
My shame turned to anger the second day. And I literally walked by 17 churches in Waco, Texas. We had assignments that we had to do. And not one person invited me in or said hello or extended a hand or acknowledged that I was there. You become invisible when you're homeless, and people think that by walking by and not making eye contact with you, that you might not know you're homeless, and then they don't have to acknowledge it. The second day I got pissed, and about the 16th church, which was the First Baptist Church in Waco, Texas. I grew up Southern Baptist, so I can judge a little bit. I'd had enough, and this older couple with their teenage kids locked their door in their car. I'm just walking down the sidewalk, and then this other family rushed across the street when they were walking towards us, and I had enough. And I said, forgive me for saying this, I'm like, I'm an effing college president. You can look at me. It didn't work. What it did is it probably affirmed to them that people that are struggling with homelessness are to be avoided, are crazy, right? But what I understood at that point is I understood the anger. The first day I understood the shame. The second day I understood the anger. And the third day I understood the desperation. So what I would challenge you to do when you go home as advocates, as people who are here with the heart of service for our students, is to go back and remove the shame and the anger and the desperation from your processes and your people. When you can do those things, then the services that you've built will actually have the impact you intended. That's my sermon.
While we waiting on our MT, I really want to do something. Just thought about it. Out of all of you, I want anyone that have ever in their life experienced homelessness to stand, please. Now you guys see the people standing, all right? So that's a great benefit there. So these people understand what I'm going through, what Mary's going through, any other student, they understand this, okay? So you guys look at these people standing up if you're sitting down and get to know all these people because they're to help us too, because they've been there, okay? They've been there where you haven't, even though I know you want to help and you have the heart. You got a backbone here of people that have experienced this. Don't waste that at all. Thank you.
I was so captivated by the speakers and by the Twitter feed for Real College that I forgot that I have a job to do. So thank you, all of you. That was cathartic in a very deep way for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people here. So we're gonna field questions now. If does anybody, that mic? Okay, let me just put this thing down.
This is for Russell. I think you were the last one to speak. So when you're talking about getting rid of the shame and the anger, and there was a third point, and I don't know why I'm blanking on it. Yes. So when you're saying getting rid of those concerns that a homeless person may have, how do you do that? I feel like that's a very personal journey. How do you do that for someone else?
Well, I think it's a great question, and it doesn't come with an easy answer, but there are structural ways that we inflict shame and demand anger and create desperation. So it doesn't even have to look at this from your own personal journey. Just look at the systems and processes that you inflict on your students and the timing and the time it takes for those processes and when they're offered and when they're not offered and who's offering them and who's not offering them. One of the most important things that helped us, though, was all of our faculty and most of our staff went through a poverty competency certification so that we could understand the mindset that generational poverty teaches versus the mindset of the working class poor versus situational poverty. And what we learned is that we had created policies and processes based on what we would do if we happened to lose our jobs right now. So we were looking at these things from a situational perspective rather than from a generational or working class perspective. So one of the ways that we create shame is, and listen, hear me out here because this was a journey for me too. We put at Amarillo College, we put our food pantries and our clothing closets in the corners of the campus in closets, right? So our students kept telling us they're hard to get, they're hard to find, and so we said, well, where do you want them? Where would be the easiest? You know where they told us to put them? In the Ware Student Commons, which is in the heart of the campus in an all-glass enclosure. And the reaction from our faculty was shame. It was like, oh, you can't put it there. Why? Why couldn't you put it there? Tell me, why would our faculty say, oh, don't put it there in the middle of the campus in the glass enclosure? Everyone will see it. But what we were telling our students when we were hiding it is it was something worthy of shame. When we put it front and center in an all-glass enclosure and made it the centerpiece of the college, we said there's nothing to be ashamed of here. There's nothing to hide. That's what I'm talking about, how we create shame in our processes and demand anger because we take so much time and we demand paperwork and we worship at the altar of FERPA to the point of ineffectiveness.
I'd like just to add to that. In talking to students at so many campuses, I think that campuses are growing and learning, right? And I like to quote Ruben when I say, we have to call people in and honor that people are changing their mentality, and that takes longer than we intend. I went to one campus that had a food pantry, and a student told me, I'll never go back there again because the person who handed me my food said, this isn't a long-term solution. You can't keep coming back here. And she's living in her car, right? And what I wanted, I wanted to go fight that person, right? But after I worked through that, I also wanted to help that person understand perhaps what they've been going through, perhaps what they've been learning, but also reframe all of our messaging, reframe our message to a message of power and marinated in justice, that this is a justice message that we have to manifest and maintain. And so when I go to Humboldt and I see a campus that knows that that food pantry is a part, just like it is not shameful to go to financial aid, it is not shameful to enroll in SNAP or go to the food pantry, that has to be just as normalized as any other service on campus. But that's a learning process that we have to reiterate and manifest over and over and over again.
Okay, any other questions? You and then you.
So I have a comment and a question. One, I just want to say thank you for that quote. You said that no one treated me like a person, they treated me like a problem. And I think that's probably how I felt for most of my life growing up in the foster care and juvenile justice system. The second thing is, I just want to say thank you to Sarah. Sarah, pay attention.
Hey, Sarah.
So, oh hey girl. So I spoke to Sarah's class at Temple last week, and I've done a couple speaking engagements. Sorry, I feel like I should like look at you guys, but I've done a couple speaking engagements, and I've learned and developed as I've spoken at different times. Actually, my first speaking engagement was at Temple on Why Systems Fail in a criminology class. But what I will say is, for the first time in my life in Sarah's class, I felt safe. I didn't need to talk about statistics and all of these things that everyone already knew in the class. I was able to really share my story and not feel shame and not feel like it wasn't safe to do so. And that's because of Sarah's research and because of, I knew this class had an understanding of what homelessness looks like for kids because of her research. And so I felt okay to share that. And I got really good feedback. And Sarah said to me afterwards, I think that what you said will really last with everyone because I gave real life experiences, real life examples, and I didn't hide anything. So I just wanted to say thank you to Sarah for allowing me to feel safe for the first time. You are my hero, and so thank you for what you do. And so now to the question. One of my biggest concerns, and that's likely just because of the way I grew up in an abusive household, is I was often thinking about, do I want to be abused or do I want to be homeless? And I almost looked at being abused as a protective factor. And so for any of you who know about ACEs, which probably most of you do, we know that kids do need these protective factors, and I thought that my outcomes would be better, speaking of research, I thought my outcomes and what statistics say is that it would be better if I was abused, because I can get counseling for that later, than to be homeless. And my goal is to never have a child or a young person have to choose between being abused or having food to eat or a place to live. And so I want us to stop coming up with Band-Aids and start stitching things up and looking at sustainability. So my question to everyone up here is, how do you deal with kids who are, or how do you handle situations where kids are being abused and they're struggling with homelessness, housing insecurity, couch surfing, and abuse? And also, what does it mean to be sustainable? How can you give a kid a plate of food knowing that food is digested, right? So that they're gonna be hungry again the next day. What do we do long term? I know maybe it's a rhetorical question. I know there's no simple answer, but I just really challenge everyone to think about the sustainability, and if you guys have any feedback on that. Mic drop.
Who wanna go first? Everybody looking at me, I tell you, boy. Philly's a rough crowd. I think one thing, basically, we as the homeless, we have our own responsibility too. Okay, it goes both ways. And with me, I learned that that's what being vocal helped me understand. And how I've succeeded from a roof over my head this past September, but still homeless, to now was I took my own responsibility too, even though I've had a lot of people to assist me. It wasn't where I was sitting back, okay, what else y'all gonna do for me, too. So I made a plan for myself. Like right now, my plan while I'm in college, I'm a major in communications and media art with an emphasis on film, so I do music, poetry, I have a large following. So I'm focusing on that, to build my foundation. I'm focusing on doing mini documentaries, and short films while I'm in school. Most people wait till afterwards, like, okay, well, when I finish, I'm gonna do some films. No, I'm doing all of that now, and once I graduate from a university, I plan on actually following my late grandmother's footsteps, and actually adding it a little bit further and becoming Congresswoman. So it's basically a matter of, again, not just one-sided. It's, working as a team, like I showed you guys who stood up. My team, in fact, I also have the Vice Chancellor here from Houston Community College. Vice, where you at? Oh, there she is. So, next. Russell, you or anybody next?
Thank you very much for raising these really important issues, and thank you, Justice. That's great. As you alluded to at the end, there are no shiny objects here. These are complex challenges and so on. But I think there are a few promising movements. One is towards more coordinated systems response to homelessness, and in the youth space, we fought for a long time. People fought before, when I was a baby, to really decriminalize youth homelessness. The Runaway and Homeless Youth Act came about. It was a really important moment for this field. And that Runaway and Homeless Youth Act has funded a set of programs that have been very important in providing supports and services and assistance to young people. At the same time, I think now where we're all as a field trying to go is how to go from programs to coordinated systems so that we can tailor responses more effectively to individual young persons' needs beyond what one program could ever do. In principle, that's what we should be achieving with coordinated, collaborative response, drawing on all of the assets of a community. I think we still have a ways to experiment to get that right, but I think that's a principle that we should all aspire to. And then secondly, I would say it's very important to think of housing as prevention. Housing as prevention for HIV/AIDS, housing as prevention for abuse, and not just shelter. Shelter can provide respite. But so before I worked where I do now, I was an economist for the World Bank, working on global policy around gender-based violence. And one of the things we consistently saw in our data was that women who had land holdings or land options or land titles were less exposed to domestic violence than similar women who didn't. Why? Because they had a viable exit option. And for a woman or a child or a young person who is entrapped in their situation because they don't have a believable, credible, viable exit option for safe and stable housing beyond what they're currently exposed to, it is very difficult to escape that type of situation. So I think that's why we really need to make sure we have a good, sufficient supply of youth-centric housing solutions for young people in our communities.
My name is Nick Freudenberg. I teach public health at the City University of New York. And for the last 6 or so years, my group has been tracking the prevalence of food insecurity and homelessness among CUNY's 280,000 students. And we find that for every student that is homeless, there may be 10 times as many who have housing problems, more rent than they can pay, an abusive parent or partner, threat of eviction, deteriorated housing, fires. And we think a lot about finding the right balance between addressing the needs of students who are homeless and addressing the needs of students who could tomorrow be homeless. And I wonder if each of you could say a few things about your thoughts on the right way of balancing the needs of those two intersecting groups, and what are ways to engage both policymakers and university systems in thinking about both those populations. Thank you.
I guess I'll take a crack at that. In the experience of the fields dealing with family homelessness and single adult homelessness, a paradigm has emerged around intervening at the threshold of homelessness, like prevention for people who are about to become homeless versus people who are recently homeless. And there are a lot of challenges there. But the paradigm, the service paradigm has been called progressive engagement. The idea being that for as many people as you can identify, you provide the lightest touch intervention that you can, because it's the least costly and can be done on a scalable basis to as many people as possible. So I think in that context, some of the stuff that Sarah and the Wisconsin Hope Lab have done around the light touch economic assistance for students who are struggling and need emergency cash, sort of as a parallel to that. And then for folks, they're sort of like let's say the 10 folks, the 100% of that need. And then for the 30 to 40% whose need continues to persist past that, you try to provide an increasing amount of assistance and also understand more about what's going on in the situation. And that's the whole, and so on and so on. So that's the whole idea behind progressive engagement, is that as people's need continues, the intensity of supports continue, and the intensity of engagement continues in parallel with that. And the idea being to avoid being over heavy-handed and intrusive for the people who really just need a little bit of assistance to avoid homelessness. So I guess that's the approach that's emerged that I would describe there. I would say, though, the other challenge in prevention, which is something that folks in public health are well aware of, is that it's hard to measure what hasn't occurred. And so when you're successful with broader-based prevention programs, it's hard to know you've done so. So it's hard to get support for those kind of programs. And what we also learn in homelessness is most of the people who come into the homelessness assistance system have never sought prevention services. So yes, prevention can work, but unfortunately 9 out of 10 people who come in as homeless didn't seek it out because most of them didn't even think they were at risk. It was a crisis that emerged very quickly and they became homeless. So there's a number of tensions in that space around the prevention and homelessness.
Hi, I'm Sippy Shradhar. I am a grad student at the University of South Alabama and founder and executive director of Donor to Diner. And it was mentioned before, or at some point, someone mentioned that the term homelessness itself kind of carries this, what I assumed was some sort of negative connotation that creates these feelings of shame and just discomfort. So what would you suggest in terms of language that we should use to encourage people to seek resources or even start a conversation that might keep preconceived notions at bay?
So I've just got a couple of thoughts on this. Well, one is, at least in the youth space recently, the National Youth Leadership Forum on Homelessness, for example, is a group of young people with lived experience. And in some cases, it's not the homelessness term itself, it's the ordering of it. They prefer youth experiencing homelessness over homeless youth, so that they're still identified as a person who has an experience, rather than being solely labeled by the experience itself. And so I think that's one of the things that a lot of us are really trying to recognize and appreciate better in the way we message things. And the other part of this is beyond specific words, if you use another word, eventually it's going to attach the same stigma to it, right? So for one of the things that I think has been useful both in the gender-based violence space and in the youth homelessness space we're seeing a lot more of, are kind of one-stop shops or drop-in centers, especially in maybe more urban communities where a young person, we have one of these in Washington, D.C., for example, with the Runaway Homeless Youth Provider. They have seen volumes more young people now coming into contact, getting assessed in coordinated entry, because they have these youth-specific drop-in centers during the day, where a young person can come for any need. They don't need to just come because they're homeless. They might have another crisis or a situation, or they need a place to just rest for a couple of hours. And that youth-friendly, youth-centric space is available to them. And some young people will come and say, I'm helpless, homeless, help me. Another young person might take 3, 4, 5 visits before they come and develop enough trust with the staff that are working with them and the environment to announce themselves as experiencing homelessness. So I would really think about the systems in higher education that could be set up where a young person doesn't have to come in and raise their hand and say, I'm homeless, but they could come in for more general supports and services, and when the time is right for that young person, they could say, yes, I would really appreciate some supports or services, or can you tell me more about these rental options or subsidies?
Thank you for that answer. I'll ask this follow-up question too. So what I meant was not just talking about it to someone, but also in advertising programs. Because we don't have time to have a conversation, and so how can I draw people in without actually making them uncomfortable or creating the shame or just creating these negative emotions that would prevent someone from accessing those resources?
Sure. So I agree with you that person-first language is so important. On our campus at Long Beach, we have a program called the Student Emergency Intervention and Wellness Program, and we in the CSU often discuss our programs in terms of basic needs, but I was having a great conversation with a student named Esperanza Aceves, who was talking about how when she was just throwing in search terms, she couldn't find us, right? Because the lack of use of homelessness, housing, food, because we were so worried about that stigma, was making it really hard for people to find us. And so, you know, it's a hard place to be in, because I know students who are living in a tent outside who will say, well, this is a tent, that's my home, I'm not homeless. But when they're searching for us, still need to find housing, food, homelessness, and to use those keywords. So we have to have that balance of talking about students in their power and allowing them to find us using the key terms so that they can get to us at the same time. Does that make sense?
Transitional issues would be kind of one to use to transitional issues, because it covers homelessness and other issues that students may have too. But that can open the door a little bit more for those shy homeless students.
Certainly couch surfing is a very common term that's less stigmatizing right now, but a lot of people would recognize what you were talking about if you wanted to market services to people who are couch surfing.
To add before the next question though, I really think on any university, since we're dealing with financial aid a lot, the financial coaches are very important. They're not known. In fact, I didn't even know I had a financial coach probably until like the third term. And I'm like, what? I got a financial coach? And of course, he was trying at the time to find resources, even though now it's a lot better for Joe. But I think universities and colleges, they need to get together with their financial coaches. And also when you have students enrolling, direct them to those that should be part of the procedure for any new student. Direct them to those financial coaches, because they're basically can be established at the one to help those homeless students because they have the resources. I think, you know, that would be one of the best things, and I'm sure HCC is the only college with financial coaches. So
I want to respond to that quickly too, and maybe more to the other side of that issue than to your question specifically, because I think you have good answers on how you can language it and help people access it. I would challenge the rest of us to think about that question in an entirely different way. We don't need to advertise our services. What we need to do is to systemize the interventions with predictive analytics, with relationships, with social service providers and our ISDs, where we're not asking students to opt into these services, they're just getting the services.
Yes.
And they might not even need to know or care who's giving them the service. That they just know that it's someone within the institution or within the community. And it's where my FERPA worshiping resistance comes from, because our local ISD has 30,000 students. They have documented over 3,000 of their students are homeless. And until we had a change in leadership, there wasn't a willingness to share that data. And what we found is some of our theories were true. If the student was in elementary or middle or high school and was homeless, then their parents were probably homeless, and their parents might be a student at Amarillo College, or more importantly, they should be a student at Amarillo College. So we could do a full family wraparound service with our ISD partners, just in data sharing and connecting resources that we already had, rather than marketing so that they know we're available and hope that they come in and get it.
Oh, another thing real quick, you guys know you actually go and recruit people to come to your college and universities. So when you're doing that, you pass by homeless people, you can recruit them too, because again, I come from a work background. It wasn't for a friend just suggesting HCC, I would have never been a student at HCC. So while you're recruiting those students, you see a homeless person, talk to them. Let them know what, you have, what they can develop from going to a university, because I'm telling you, the second time around, it's a lot different, and it's more than youth. I'm a second time around. There's a lot of second time around people that are changing their job positions and things, that are coming back to college, So those homeless people, talk to them. I bet you get a lot of them that want to come to school. You just basically need to know how to take care of them once they get there.
Hi everyone, Claire Katie, I'm at Temple. And I want to direct us, so some of the things that I've been hearing in some of the conversation I've been hearing here, my apologies, is I hear New York City, I hear Philadelphia, I hear Los Angeles, I hear Houston, I hear cities, I hear Matthew saying urban areas. I want to talk a little bit about homelessness in rural areas. Russell, even Amarillo isn't that rural compared to some of the institutions that are actually here today. What thoughts do you have on addressing this in areas where the nearest homeless shelter is an hour and a half away, and where homelessness does look different, and where services look different?
So I'm really glad you raised that. So actually over the next month and really the next 8 to 9 months, we're going to be talking a lot about the spatial realities of homelessness. And one of those realities is that our data show that youth homelessness prevalence isn't really much different in rural communities than it is in non-rural communities. And I think that's counter to a lot of images that people have in their head about the nature and distribution of homelessness. So I'm glad you've raised it. At the same time, the infrastructure is different, the needs are different in these different situations. I think in the youth space, we've been looking at more options and interventions that don't require a young person to leave their community if they don't need to. But then how do you do that with limited resources? If there are 30 homes in a community, then a shelter or one apartment complex in that community might not make sense anymore, right? So I think where we're looking at is for more short-term solutions, things like host homes or brokered homes with families or relatives or trusted adults that can house a young person for a short period of time. And then looking at housing options, scattered site types of housing options that can be distributed so that a young person has a better chance of accessing housing and services that are closer to where they live. The last resort should always be pulling a young person away from the community that they know and where there's a shot at them rebuilding a network that can help them sustainably exit homelessness. That being said, in the systematic review I mentioned of interventions, we found about 60 impact studies of interventions for youth experiencing homelessness or for prevention. Guess how many of them had specifically assessed the effects of interventions for rural youth homelessness? Any guesses?
Very few.
Zero. Doesn't mean some of them didn't include some rural youth, but zero had specifically studied effects or disaggregated the effects for youth experiencing homelessness in rural communities. So we have a lot to learn here, but we know enough to get started.
So we're gonna start wrapping this up. We're gonna do 3 questions and then have the panelists answer each one very quickly. So we'll start over here.
Hello everyone, this is Ruben from The Pillar. Yeah, quick question. So I know that one of the conversations that we're having is how colleges and universities don't get to dictate the price point of housing in their communities that they're a part of. So what strategies have you all, what effective strategies do you all know about of educating unions and associations and owners of properties to educate them about college student homelessness and what they have affordable to them? And also curious about any data that showcases how much per square footage college students are paying, and how does it compare to non-college student zip codes? Because the hypothesis is that because of the high turnaround of college students and properties, you can increase the price of that rental area consistently in a way that other folks that are living there for much longer do. So both, I know that's kind of like two questions.
We had a hand over here. And 3. Okay, cool. So let me just run this mic over here. Here you go.
Thank you. Michael Mira, Tacoma, Washington. Do college students who experience homeless, are they more likely to have been homeless in their younger years, or is college breeding a new phenomenon of homelessness?
Question numero 3. Great exercise.
Hello, my name is Michelle McClendon, and I'm from Highline College in Seattle, Washington. And one of the questions that I have is, when we're talking about homelessness, and I know for me and my campus, one of the things, we have international student housing. Well, for me, I have students in my own backyard, literally, with sleeping bags. So my question is, how can we be more inclusive? I mean, homeless is a kind of, to me, it's a form of discrimination, considering the fact that if you're coming from somewhere else and you're going to school there, of course, they're going to charge you 3 times, 4 times the rates. You have to prove that you have money to be there. These students can't prove that they have money to be there. I mean, so going forward, I mean, how do we be inclusive? Like if we have international housing, then why can't we utilize some of those floors to help our own homeless students? So how do we go forward, or can we even make that a policy from a policy level? I mean, I'm an advocate. I registered lobbyist. I actually wrote one law that in Seattle, it's the Seattle Housing Ordinance, and one of the studies that we did is we realized that a lot of people were homeless due to the fact that they had criminal histories. I just have one student on my caseload where she just ended up with charged with a misdemeanor and never had a criminal history because she was homeless and she was somewhere and the police was called and they charged her with trespassing because she was trying to find a comfortable place to be out of harm's way, which she had already had issues with before. So going forward as institutions, and we all know that there's a lot of things that, barriers and red tape, how do we be inclusive to our own?
I guess I would just say that I think the colleges and universities, with the housing stock they have, should be able to provide some portion of that at a subsidy, which most of them do not at this time. I mean, they subsidize the education oftentimes with grants and loans, but not the living expenses. And it seems to me that that's something that's achievable, because certainly the countervailing trend has been that colleges and universities are competing to become more and more like a resort, and the housing being even more and more exclusive. And so they've actually created a housing price war almost, in the sense of, competing amenities. The same is with the cafeterias. There should be the $2 meal at every cafeteria every day that someone could be able to afford, rather than having to have a food pantry, which is so stigmatizing for a student to have to go there and say, oh, I'm in this group of people who needs a food pantry. And there are other countries, like in Germany, where the college cafeterias are open to the public, and there's always a $2 food line, so that even low-income people from the community can come in and get the subsidized meal, at least for 1 or 2 meals a day. So again, it's like the countervailing trend is that the food offerings at colleges are becoming increasingly boutique-ish and, like food courts that are very expensive, rather than continuing to think about access. So I think there's, some component there of some ideas. Anyway, yeah.
So I just have a couple of thoughts on your question, and maybe Rashida, you have other information on this. But so I don't specifically look at right now whether college students in particular had experiences of homelessness prior to, though it's something we could do with our data, so I'll take a look. But one of the things we do see with our in-depth interviews with 215 youth in 5 communities is that we ask them to tell us where their trajectories, their story of homelessness began. And for these young adults, 18 to 25 years old, the vast majority, about 3 out of 4 of them, talk about their trajectories of homelessness and housing instability starting in adolescence or childhood. And about a quarter of them, their experiences as unaccompanied youth started in the context of family homelessness. And I think this is important because, I think getting to, previous comments on this panel, we can do better to identify young people, based on certain risk factors who are more likely to be experiencing homelessness or housing instability or food insecurity. It won't get everybody, but I think we can be more proactive taking the information we know about who's at risk and not making them come to services, bringing the services and supports to those young people.
Yeah, I agree with him on that. Actually, even with myself, I've actually searched my family tree, and there was no homeless issue until I came along, and I think, everyone has a different reason for being homeless. As far as it being trending in college, it may be only for some. It wasn't for me where it was a trend more than, okay, I can go to college and get an education. And so I saw the importance for some students. They may look at it like, I can go to college and I'll get funds given to me. So because there's like a lack of help everywhere else now. So actually, you may have a lot of students coming to colleges and universities seeking help that are homeless, but while they're there, it can be impacted just like it was for me. It's a great experience as far as an education. I'm telling you, I'm like thrilled in history. I can tell you everything about history in government now that passed me before. But one thing, and I don't know because I'm talking to university and colleges, but I do think this should start in school. I remember when I was in school, I didn't know nothing about banking. Literally, they should have a class called Life, for you when you graduate, and I think with that, and seriously, and bringing people in to speak and things like that, it will help a lot when you get into situations just like I've been. Like, I didn't know when I became homeless, there would be no help for me in the organizations. Little bitty things like that I had no knowledge about, but I think if you started really in high school where you're educating the students, just like me, it probably would have been a better turnaround, and education, I think, would have been respected more, because I didn't respect education until the second time around. The first time, I made little A's and stuff. It didn't excite me, but this time, because I was on academic probation after the second term, I almost wasn't able to get any funds. So I said, okay, well, I got to build this up, so I'm gonna make straight A's. I had to fight for 3 classes. I made those straight A's, and my enrollment manager, she said, well, honey, you got to have 4 classes to be on the dean's list. I never thought about that, and I was just like, all right, I'm gonna be on the dean's list. So in that spring, I made 4 straight A's, and then that's when Dean Adams found out he's at A-Leave, and he stole me from Central, because I go to Central too, and put me on A-Leave to dean's list. So Dean Anzino, that's how that happened, and I'm on your dean's list, just so you know.
We're going to let Russell have the last comment.
I think your question about, because really what your question is on the residents is a policy question. And I loved being a faculty member. I loved the classroom a lot more than I love being a president, frankly. But when you're a faculty in a classroom, or you're an advisor, or you're a financial coach, you don't get to affect policy issues like that. And so I'm calling all of you to think about your career path. We have to have people like Sarah as presidents of institutions so that we can change policies and practices, and they become enculturated rather than niche personality-driven issues. So go, make policy.
And Sarah for president,
Somebody else
all
be
right.
president. All right, let's thank this fabulous panel and our wonderful facilitator, Liz.